Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Recovery Talk. So, you guys know that I have a tendency of, talking about some of the very sneaky and insidious parts of an eating disorder that is often overlooked even in treatment. And one of those behaviors is excessive consumption of zero-calorie or low-calorie beverages. I want to make it clear that this is not something everyone with an eating disorder is experiencing, So if you don't experience this, maybe this episode won't be as interesting for you. But if you are some of those people who do experience an excessive consumption of beverages during your eating disorder and find this a little bit baffling and difficult to let go of, then you might find this episode insightful. So I say excessive consumption of zero-calorie or low-calorie beverages. So typical examples of this can be just water. But what I very often see that people consume excessively is soda, zero-calorie soda, such as, Diet Coke, Pepsi Max, these kind of things. So basically like zero-calorie sodas, fizzy drinks. And also things such as, zero-calorie squash and tea. That's a very common one, especially like green tea or just herbal tea in general. Coffee, especially black coffee, but some also may excessively consume coffee with, for instance, a little bit of, milk. But again, it varies. It's usually beverages that are zero or low calories. So you don't often see the same behavior around, for instance, like milkshakes. And if it is, I would say that's not really a disorder thing. That's probably like a good thing, getting in the calories, right? Of course, if someone is using beverages instead of eating because they don't like the feeling of eating, then that might be something else to discover. But I would say that this episode is more about people filling up on beverages, right? And a key part of it is that the beverages they're filling up on has very few or no calories, and that they are filling up on these beverages whether they realize it or not, that it's part of the eating disorder and part of this desire to fill up, to make the quote unquote most out of the calories. And also very often it could start as a way to kind of curb hunger or cravings, and then gradually it becomes so ingrained that it actually becomes almost a habit, right? Because someone has become so used to constantly, for instance, sipping water that they don't realize it's part of their disorder. They just think, I just make sure to drink a lot of water, right? But then it has come so far that they can't really feel even their thirst cues anymore because they're so used to just drinking, and completely forgetting that the body will tend to tell you, hey, you need to drink, right? We have thirst cues for a reason. There is a bit of a myth in, the good old diet culture that we, for some reason, just need to chug down ridiculous amounts of water. And it's just not true. It's just not true that we need to drink extreme amounts of water to be healthy. If anything, this can have negative health effects because you're essentially flushing out a lot of salts, electrolytes, etc., if you're drinking extremely excessive amounts. Of course, we need water. We need to drink. We need to stay hydrated. That is obviously true. But what I see sometimes in some people with eating disorders is that they will drink so excessive amount of fluids, and it becomes this like habit for them, and they become almost anxious if they can't do it. I have previously done an episode on liquid calories and the fear of liquid calories. So this episode would be more not necessarily the fear of liquid calories, even though that kind of ties in a little bit. It'll be more the urge to excessively drink water, Diet Coke, tea, coffee, etc. And maybe people aren't quite aware of why they do that. So I want to dig into some common reasons why people with eating disorders or those in recovery do this behavior, and look a bit at, what's behind and what are some potential solutions here. This does not mean that you cannot, enjoy drinking tea or enjoy drinking coffee or enjoy having a nice cold soda on a summer day. Like, this is not what I'm saying. I'm not saying these behaviors are inherently disordered, That would just be so ridiculous. Like, Is it disorder to drink water? No. But we're talking excessive amounts and doing it for disordered reasons, okay? So, for example, imagine someone has a strong craving for something sweet, right? And they're maybe in recovery or have an eating disorder, and they have this strong sweet cravings. And instead of actually having something sweet, because they're hungry and they need something to eat, they are reaching for some Diet Coke to kind of satisfy this urge for a sweet snack. Or some people might use to drink, excessive amounts of coffee or tea for a variety of reasons. Maybe they're trying to suppress their appetite somehow, or it just becomes some kind of like orthorexic thing where they look for some kind of special health benefit from these products. And this is not to say that coffee or tea can't have benefits for people. It absolutely can. Some people might find that drinking a cup of peppermint tea can soothe them if their tummy hurts. And other people might feel like having some coffee can make them feel a bit more awake. So again, there is nuance here. But one thing that I hear very commonly is people excessively drinking, for instance, green tea, thinking that it will somehow speed up their metabolism. And if you've listened to my episode on metabolism, if your metabolism is slowed down due to energy restriction of calories coming in, then obviously excessively drinking a 0-calorie drink is not going to help heal your metabolism. What needs to happen for you to heal a metabolism that's slowed down due to energy restriction is, of course, to get in more energy, right? I know that when I say it like this, it makes total logical sense, but oh my God, the eating disorder, as I talk about in a lot of episodes, will tend to come with all sorts of conspiracies and find solutions that is more in alignment with the eating disorder. So for example, oh my God, my metabolism is really low. Yeah, obviously logically it's because you are restricting, which we know that the body reacts by slowing down metabolism as a response. But instead of the natural solution being increasing your energy intake, your eating disorder will be like, no. Green tea. Green tea is going to speed it back up, And so you can see this eating disorder is so selective. It always will choose options that align with the eating disorder. And I think this can sometimes come in when it comes to, excessive drinking of, for instance, let's say Diet Coke or Pepsi Max as well. I see that people will, for instance, they will get cravings at night, right? You're getting some cravings for a snack, and your eating disorder will convince you, this just shows that you should not be around snack because you have this uncontrollable craving. You have this sweet tooth, right? We need to find something to handle this. We need to find something to suppress this, right? And then, you reach for the Diet Coke. When actually, if you're experiencing that, you really want something sweet, you want something to eat, then obviously the solution would be to have that snack, right? Nothing wrong with having some Diet Coke, but maybe having it on the side then would be better, and having it in addition to the snack that you actually want. So let me tell you guys a bit about my story because I was obsessed with Pepsi Max, specifically Pepsi Max, but also like Cola Zero, Cola Light, Diet Coke, and honestly most kind of 0-calorie sodas, but it was specifically Pepsi Max was like my main thing. And I would actually use the Pepsi Max as a way to soothe my cravings for something nice and sweet, to soothe my cravings for having a snack whilst, for instance, like watching a documentary, right? I wanted something to enjoy, and Pepsi Max became something that I could enjoy without guilt. And of course, what happens when I drink Pepsi Max is that it's not like I have a sip and then I'm satisfied. No. I just wanted more and more and more, because it doesn't really fill you up, because I'm hungry. I want something sweet. And then my body is instead getting something with 0 calories. That's essentially, I'm trying to trick my body somehow. And our bodies are smart. Our bodies can tell when you're filling up on this thing that has no calories. So then I just want to drink more, right? It did not really help. Did not solve the problem. Or I saw it as a problem. I saw my cravings as a problem when they're actually part of the solution, which I'll come back to a bit later. So at the height of my Pepsi Max addiction, and I use addiction very loosely because obviously it's not an addiction per se. I mean, yes, you can to some extent get some withdrawal symptoms because of the caffeine and stuff. So you may notice a headache if you remove it abruptly. But it was more than anything like a mental addiction for me. And like I would use the Pepsi Max instead of having actual snacks that I wanted, right? So at the height of this quote unquote addiction, I would drink like up to like 3 liters of Pepsi Max per day. The equivalent of that is two large Pepsi Max bottles a day. Not like the small one, but the large ones per day. And I could at times even drink more, but that was usually what I would go through in a day. So I would literally just spend my day constantly drinking Pepsi Max. And honestly, it's kind of annoying because obviously when you're drinking 3 liters of soda per day, you need to pee all the friggin' time. I already had a small and weak bladder. Oh my God, I would literally just pee nonstop, it's not really, it's really annoying. And Pepsi Max has a slight diuretic effect as well, which can make you a little bit more dehydrated and definitely make you pee a lot. So yeah, anyways, that was my kind of semi-addiction. But here's the thing. What I noticed as I started recovery was that the urges to excessively drink Pepsi Max, they kind of just gradually lessened. Because I was feeding and nourishing myself, my body would kind of feel more satisfied, right? I didn't have this constant urge, to, what can I say? Drink excessive amounts of soda. So for instance, if I was watching a documentary, I had snacks to watch the documentary. I didn't just excessively drink soda. I had other things to consume as well. And of course, as I moved out of the undernourishment state, eventually my urges to constantly consume, whether that is food or beverages, also went down. I also had some tendencies to excessively drink teas as well. And I remember for me, I would kind of try and use teas as a way to drink the things that I didn't allow myself to eat. For example, I remember one time I found like a tea that was like, I don't even know what the flavor was. It was some kind of like pastry flavor. Like, I think it was like carrot cake tea or apple pie flavored tea or strawberry cream. I don't know. It was something like that, right? And this is, of course, what I desperately craved. And I was so excited. Oh my God, I found a tea with this flavor. And I remember as well, I found like this chocolate tea. And don't get me wrong, it's a nice tea. But I kind of desperately try and use this to get, a taste of what I actually really should have just let myself eat. And I would also get very, very excited whenever I found like a new brand of tea, a new type of tea. I remember I found like teas that would mimic certain foods or certain flavors that I didn't allow myself to have, basically. And I would be the same thing with sodas, right? So for instance, if there was like a new flavor of soda, and like, don't get me wrong, it's always, fun when you are in the store and like, oh, there's a new Coca-Cola out, It's always fun to try it. But in my case, it was this extreme obsession and excitement and like, oh my God, and like this hunt for like these new flavors and just this like, yeah, very, very extreme obsession and like niche interest. And like, was I that interested in finding a vanilla Diet Coke before my eating disorder? No, I was not. So, if you just notice like a newfound obsessive interest with different tea flavors or soda flavors or whatnot, and this just so happened to occur during a period of restriction, may not be a genuine interest. And it's very interesting because in the Minnesota starvation study, which I've done an episode about and I keep referencing, they also noticed that the men would start drinking more and more tea and coffee, right? They started really increasing their intake of tea and coffee. And here's the interesting thing. They also noticed that the men would report feeling more, excited and satisfied by consuming tea and coffee. They even had to limit the amount of tea and coffee that the men were allowed to drink per day because it would become so obsessive. But yeah, here's the thing. As I said, they would report feeling more, satisfied and excited and, finding it more pleasurable to drink tea and coffee than they did before. The same thing tends to happen with, food in general, right? When you are undernourished, you will, even though food can be scary and anxiety provoking sometimes, especially you come to a point in recovery where you notice that food becomes extremely rewarding, which then makes you think, oh my God, I'm developing emotional eating, right? And that's not what's happening, and I've spoken about that before. But it's a little bit similar to what is happening when someone is undernourished, is that also consuming beverages gives you more of like a kick, like a high, like when I went to the grocery store and I realized that there was a new flavor of Diet Coke, then I would get like a kick, like, whoa, this is exciting, right? And I think when you are in the depths of restriction, right, and you're thinking, okay, I am excessively drinking, whether that's tea or coffee or soda or whatsoever, and it can be difficult to think like, how am I going to stop this? Because this feels so addictive. This feels so rewarding, right? But could it be that restriction can be the driving force or a contributor to this addiction? Because restriction has a tendency of creating addictive-like behaviors around a lot of things, We know restriction creates addictive-like behaviors around certain foods. People will self-report feeling addictive around certain foods, right? We know that restriction is the driving force in a lot of those cases. And here we have studies indicating that this could be the same thing with excessive consumption of tea, coffee, soda, etc., zero-calorie beverages during periods of restriction. And there's also just an obsession with drinking water, and some people may find water drinking also quite rewarding, but a lot of people may do it as like a habit, or some people feeling like, like it could be like a diet culture idea because it's constantly drink more water. And I understand that, for a lot of people who forget drinking water, this can be helpful. But if you are someone who's obsessively drinking water as a way to kind of fill yourself up, or because you feel like you have to do that or your metabolism will just end, like stop functioning, or there's some kind of disordered belief around that, then maybe that could be something to challenge. And if you are in a point where you're thinking, well, no, it's not disordered, I just enjoy it, right? Kind of little test you could do with yourself is, okay, your excessive consumption of, let's say, Diet Coke is not disordered. But if you change the Diet Coke with sugary Coke, how would you respond to that? Would you still drink as much? And very often the answer is no. Because your eating disorder has told you this is 0 calories, this is something you can enjoy unlimited. But as long as when it starts getting calories, then it's like, oh, no. And I very often see this thing where someone will be okay or like okay-ish eating, for instance, let's say a chocolate bar, right? With, let's say, 200 calorie chocolate bar. They rather eat that chocolate bar rather than drinking a, 100 calorie can of Coca-Cola that's not Diet Coke. Even though the chocolate bar may have more calories than the can of Coke, just because it goes against their eating disorder rule and they feel like they're not getting as much out of the calories. If you want to know more about that, do check out the liquid calories episode because I do explore that in depth there. But yeah, so some of the sneaky things with excessive consumption of liquids, 0 calorie liquids, is that it can very quickly become a habit, right? To a point where you don't even know why you're doing it. You're just doing it. You're just sipping and sipping and sipping because it's become a habit. You may not even be conscious of it. You might just be used to, you constantly have your water bottle next to you and you just sip, 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 sip. And you may wonder like, what is the harm, right? What is the harm? And, is there even a harm of just constantly sipping a bit of water? Isn't that like a good thing, staying hydrated? And I'm not necessarily saying that, you need to stay away from water. Again, like I'm not saying any of these things. But if the thought of not having that water bottle next to you makes you very anxious, then it could be worth investigating. For example, imagine you were going to go somewhere and you forgot your water bottle. Would that create major anxiety? And also, is the excessive drinking causing some inconveniences? For instance, imagine if you're excessively drinking, whether it's water or Diet Coke or whatsoever, coffee. Is it, for instance, making you pee all the time and it becoming kind of annoying? And it's also interesting because a lot of people in recovery will complain about like physical fullness and feeling physically full. If you are excessively drinking water, that water is obviously going in your stomach and it could maybe make you feel even more full, yet you're full, but you haven't taken in the calories, right? So if you're excessively bloated in recovery, then excessively chugging down on water may not be your best bet. Then again, there are some people who go in the complete opposite direction. I've seen this a few times as well, where they are terrified of any liquids and they will restrict liquids in the same way that they are restricting food. If you fall into that category, I want you to remember that a lot what I said earlier wouldn't apply to you. Dehydration is not good for us either. Overhydration or underhydration is not good for us. None of those are good for us. If someone is extremely dehydrated, it can actually ironically make them hold on to more water retention because that's often how our body cope with being quite dehydrated. And even though excessive water drinking can worsen, for example, bloating just because there's more, liquid in the stomach, Not drinking anything at all can, of course, make it worse, because we do need some liquids to keep things moving, right? So yeah, I just wanted to say that because I don't want to give ammunition to anyone's eating disorders. That's something that I always need to be very, very careful about when I'm talking about certain behaviors, right? And if someone has a different behavior, I don't want them to be like, well, see, that means that now I can continue the disordered behavior. In itself, if there is a disordered behavior, then working on targeting it, whether that is excessive consumption of liquids or restricting liquids, you should target the disordered behaviors, right? And do the opposite of what your eating disorder is telling you. So for example, if you're someone restricting liquids, then obviously the solution would be to increase your liquids. And if you're someone who is excessively consuming liquids as a way to, fill up whatsoever, then of course the solution would be to, when you are having that craving for like a Diet Coke, maybe notice, are you maybe craving something sweet? Are you craving a snack? Maybe have that instead of trying to camouflage it with liquids. I see so many people with eating disorders who are excessively consuming, especially like Pepsi Max. I don't know if it's, especially like in my home country of Norway, whenever I have a Norwegian client, I just almost know that they're going to have an excessive consumption of Pepsi Max. I don't know if it's like a cultural thing, but like Norwegian recovers will know exactly what I'm talking about. It's very, very common. Or maybe Scandinavian in general, I don't know. And yeah, don't get me wrong, Pepsi Max is a really nice beverage. I still enjoy some Pepsi Max, But again, it is not a coincidence that so many people with an eating disorder will constantly have that bottle next to them, or just be extremely excited about, oh, there's a new Pepsi Max Cherry in town, Again, they're amazing sodas. I love them, but still, there's a line here, right? Only you can know through being very honest with yourself if you are someone who just enjoys having some soda now and then, or if it is becoming an excessive pattern, and if you're trying to maybe cover up for a craving that you have. And also, is that really working? Because if it was working to cover up the craving with Pepsi Max, you wouldn't feel like drinking like 3 liters like I did, for example. And today's listener question is very much tied into today's episode. And the question goes, quite often, for very good reasons, we hear about extreme hunger, but is extreme thirst also a thing? And the person goes on to say that they are actually experiencing what feels like both at the same time. So I feel like they're experiencing extreme hunger, but also extreme thirst. And they're also saying that they know the optimal solution to extreme hunger, obviously, will be to give into it to eat, right? But what would the solution be to extreme thirst? Should you just drink a lot? What is going on? This is a bit of a difficult one, right? Because we first need to figure out, why is the extreme thirst happening? Is it a thing? Yes, I hear this from a lot of people. And I am not a doctor, so I cannot go in like extreme depth about the potential factors. But there are a few things that kind of strikes to me as potential reasons. So first of all, it could be the thing that I've spoken about earlier, that it is like an urge to kind of fill up, right? But also, we know that when we're eating a lot in recovery and the body is maybe retaining more water, then the water we drink could go to, being retained in the body, if that makes sense, go to being water retention instead of kind of coming out. So what I've seen a lot of people report when they are experiencing extreme hunger is that they report being extremely thirsty. But then if I ask them, well, are you peeing excessively? A lot of them say, no, not really. It's like I'm drinking, but I'm not really like peeing that much, That could be a sign that the water is either being retained in the body, that you're experiencing some water retention, especially if you're experiencing other symptoms of water retention, which I've spoken about in the water retention episode. Or some people may experience, when their metabolism increases, they sweat a lot. Excessive sweating is quite common with higher metabolism, which tends to happen when you're going through extreme hunger. So if you're sweating a lot, then obviously the water is kind of going out, right? It's going out through sweat. But then again, if you are experiencing extreme thirst and you are drinking a lot, but you're also noticing you're peeing a lot, then those things may or may not be the case. Because that will kind of signify that your body is not necessarily holding on to the water or sweating out the water. And you know what? I've seen cases where someone is just excessively thirsty in recovery, even though they are eating a lot. They may be going through extreme hunger and genuinely feeding themselves, and they just notice that they're also extremely thirsty. And you know what? I don't always know exactly what is happening. What I do know is that a lot of people tend to think, Well, obviously, I'm going through extreme hunger and I'm eating sugar, so this must be diabetes, right? That's, of course, eating a salt will jump to that conclusion because it's like, yeah, that means that you have a reason to restrict those foods, restrict sugar foods. But that's probably not the most probable reason, right? Because just randomly developing diabetes in recovery is not really something that tends to happen to people. But noticing that your thirst cues are a little bit off whack, it's actually pretty common, especially if you have a history of maybe not really learning to listen to your thirst cues, right? Maybe you've had a habit of excessive, drinking water or soda. And maybe the extreme hunger is just like you need to be kind of filled up, with whether that is liquid or whether that is food, it's just this urge, to constantly consume something. And then it would make sense if that could translate to thirst as well. Overall, if it is something that concerns you or something that just keeps happening and it starts to be like, hey, this has been going on for some time and it doesn't really make sense, then of course talking to a doctor could be a good idea. But overall, do also have a little think about some of the things I've said in this episode and see could there be other reasons behind it than me actually just generally being thirsty? Because extreme thirst and extreme hunger is a little bit different, because extreme hunger makes sense because you actually do need that energy, right? But the body doesn't necessarily need like 5 liters of water a day. And in recovery, there's no really any such thing as eating too much, like there's no like upper limit of like calories where you like overdose on calories, right? But there is such a thing as drinking too much water. It's very rare, but it is technically possible. What I would recommend you to do is try and drink more calorific things and see how that changes things. So for example, if you find yourself excessively drinking water, try and drink, for example, juice or milkshake or any kind of, milk drink, smoothies, etc., and see, does that change how much liquid you consume or your urges to consume liquid? I noticed for myself that when I started drinking more like calorific drinks, I felt more satisfied. And it's a bonus way to get in some calories, some much needed calories, and challenge a potential eating disorder rule if you have a fear against liquid calories, as I said in that episode. So I guess for me, that would be the suggested little tip. But again, if there's something that continues and concerns you and you think, oh wow, maybe this is unrelated to recovery, maybe this is something else, of course, talk to a doctor. Overall, I've heard it before, and it's not something you are alone in experiencing. Okay, guys, thank you so much for listening and for sticking with this podcast and supporting it, whether that is just tuning in on Tuesdays or whenever you listen, really, or sharing it on your Instagram story or leaving a rating. It really, really means a lot to me. And if you have any listener question, you're always free to DM me, but please note that I do not have capacity to answer one-on-one recovery questions. I only answer recovery questions that are like listener questions that could be relevant to answer in the podcast. Simply because I do not have capacity to answer individual one-on-ones, because this is already my job. I work with clients one-on-one. So I also have, limited capacity because I do also have, a life outside, recovery and work and all of that. But yeah, I really appreciate you guys and I hope to enjoy this week's episode and I'll see you again next week.